Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to And She Thrived. I'm very excited to have Bisma Nasar with us today, who is a social worker. Assalamu alaikum, Bisma, how are you?
Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah, how are you?
Very good. I'm really excited to speak with you today because, as we all know, grief is a huge topic when it comes to the life of a divorcee, generally speaking. I would like to introduce you. So, Bisma Nasar is a social worker licensed in New York and Pennsylvania. She received her master's in social work from Hunter College Silberman School of Social Work in 2011, where she studied individual clinical practice with families and children. Her area of focus was on immigration and global social work. Bisma is currently working for a private practice based in New York. She has experience working with women, children, adolescents, and families. Her areas of speciality include anxiety, depression, relationships, life transitions, immigration, and parenting. Bisma's goal is to help individuals, couples, and families negotiate the challenges of life with grace, compassion, and generosity. She believes in open communication and honesty between therapist and clients, where both can engage with each other in a supportive, encouraging, and non-judgmental environment. Okay, so we're very excited to have you with us.
Thank you. Yes, I'm excited to be here too. Alhamdulillah.
Yes. So, what is it that you can tell us about divorce grief? Would divorce grief be considered to be like a specific category, separate category from general grief? Or if you could just elaborate on that.
Sure. So it basically falls under the umbrella of grief. And what I like about having such a wide berth to define grief is for many of us, we grew up thinking that grief really just applies to when someone passes, right? So other areas of life, we're like, well, that's a change. It's not really grief. You're not really, you may feel sad about it. But now we know that any change leads to loss, right? And loss requires mourning, right? There's an element of that. There's an aspect of that. And mourning is just the outside representation of the grief, right? Like you can see people in mourning, but we may not necessarily see people who are grieving because it looks different. So divorce grief after
So,
divorce.
if I interject, what do you mean it looks different? How does mourning look different from grieving?
No, mourning just means it's like how one looks, they may be, like kind of what you think of like typical symptoms, right? Kind of sad, morose, removed, more quiet. Then we know, oh, they're in mourning, right? We say that, right? They're grieving a loss, they're in mourning. But grief can extend, and you can be doing your day-to-day thing. You can be living your life. You can be what looks to everybody else like, oh, they've bounced back, but you can also be grieving, right? The two are
Right.
not mutually exclusive.
Okay, so you're
So
saying that grieving is something that can be also more hidden, whereas mourning can be
yes.
becoming more manifest, more out, more obvious.
Right. And so honestly, to me, there's not much of a difference between grief as we see it when we lose somebody and grief after you experience a really traumatic and kind of intense change like the death of a marriage, right? Because that's the death of a person, this is the death of a marriage. So they're quite similar in that way that it's not like like a specialized area. You will find it's very mutual. They're not mutually exclusive. They kind of ebb and flow together. And so speaking of that grieving process, right? So when we look at, I think most of us have heard of like the 5 stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she came up with that, and that's still applicable. I like that
Are you
just
able
to
to go
see.
over that for those who?
Sure. So she said, the 5 stages of grief. The first one is denial. And the way you can kind of apply it to a marriage, right, is if you're both clearly unhappy, this is not working, it's been like that for a while, and then when you kind of one person typically may suggest it, or both kind of very maybe begrudgingly come to that realization, there can be a lot of denial, right? It's like, no, we'll work it out. Let's try counseling again. Let's try with somebody else. Let me change this. Let me, maybe I just have to work on that. Maybe we need a move. Maybe we need a new place. Maybe we need a kid,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Gosh, that's the worst.
Yes, agreed. Like, so we're just in denial that this is the process that's how this death is kind of happening in front of us. And then the next stage of the 5 stages is anger, right? So let me make sure because I wrote them down. Yeah. anger. So then you get angry. When it comes to being in a divorce, the anger can be very overwhelming, right? You can feel angry at your spouse. You can feel angry at the situation that may have brought you together, but predominantly the anger is usually self-directed. So it's anger at yourself. I didn't try hard enough, right? I didn't do enough. I'm a failure at this. Why isn't this working? Why, is my marriage falling apart? So there's a lot of anger that's inward, that's self-directed. I could have done this. I should have done that. I should, a lot of judgment too, right? These should have, would have, could have are very judgy words that we also inflict on ourselves. And so after anger is bargaining. So bargaining is kind of similar to that denial phase, right? Where you're like, maybe if I completely change my personality, they'll like me. Or maybe if we, have a kid, we can figure it out. Like, let me tweak it this way to get the end result. And that lasts for a while. And then the next stage is depression. So that's when you're kind of coming to terms with, oh, this is the reality of my life. This is where I'm at. This is really happening, right? You're kind of doing that. So and the next stage is acceptance, which they kind of blend into each other. And all these it's not linear, right? It's not like, oh, 2 weeks of anger, now I'm in my, depression stage. You jump from one to the next. Sometimes you feel like, I've accepted this. The next day you wake up and you say, no, I found somebody else who can, give us let's try this other couples counseling. They use a different method. Let's try that, So you kind of jump from one to the next. But those were her 5 stages of grief. And I find it's not applicable just to someone passing, but really to all of these major changes in life, including the death of a marriage, right? Of a divorce. So it kind of applies to that.
Right. And often, very often during this divorce period, a person might experience all of those emotions in one day.
Yes, absolutely. You can
Like a
absolutely
roller
do that.
coaster.
Yeah, and I'm actually so glad you mentioned that, because another thing that often comes up with grief and once again applicable to all types, but particularly, in this case, divorce grief, is a lot of us, a good amount of us, right? I don't think it's limited just to like a particular population. Many of us grew up in households where intense emotions were not always shown, permitted, allowed. You were only kind of allowed to be happy, to be content, to be joyful. If you express sadness or anger, it was quickly squashed, right? That's just the reality of a lot of our lives, right? And so for many of us who experience something like grief in a divorce, suddenly we're hit with this wave of emotion, like you're saying, right? Like all these feelings at once. And so we don't, many of us didn't have the skill set to process this. So now we're getting hit with, oh my gosh, I'm feeling guilty, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling so sad, I'm feeling overwhelmed, and I don't know how to make sense of this because I was never taught those skills. It's a skill set, just the way driving is a skill set, or riding a bike is. Managing these overwhelming emotions is also a skill set, which many of us didn't grow up with. Now we're like, kind of given this flood of emotion. And a lot of times it goes hand in hand with physical pain too, right? It kind of manifests also as like as physical symptoms. It can show up that way, like shortness of breath, or feeling lethargic, or feeling very full of energy, like restlessness, right? Like restless energy,
or
or stomach.
palpitations, right?
Yes, exactly. Palpitations.
Headaches, right?
Exactly, like
Pain.
stomach issues.
Mhm.
Yes, all of it. So that is also something that can happen because of that intense emotional response and reaction. And so this particular phase of grief, once again, I'm using these terms, but like we talked about earlier, right? You can jump from one to the next. You can be in one stage forever. It's not a linear process. But this kind of intense emotion, this very intense feeling, it typically falls under what we call acute grief, which is when it first happens. So when you first come to that realization, okay, I'm getting a divorce, right? When you say those words out loud, when you say, oh, okay, my marriage is ending, this is not going to work out. So that's called acute grief when it first happens. Now, people don't like to put a timeline on it, but typically it lasts up to 6 months or so. It could, of course, last longer. And, a lot of people are very anxious because it's so difficult to get past it. How long am I going to feel this way? Which is a fair question because it's not a nice feeling. But how long am I going to feel this way? Why do I feel so awful? I can't get out of bed. I feel, my stomach hurts, or I'm crying all the time. Everything sets me off. But we have to think, right? Like, if you were married for 15 years, 3 months is not going to get you to the other side, right? If you were married for however length of time, a 3 month period or a 6 month or a 2 year period is not going to really be enough to it's going to take a while, right? So giving ourselves that space, that this is hard, this is awful, I feel terrible, and it makes sense. This is something that, this was a part of my life, and now it's not. So what am I, and now what, right? And now what next?
Right. And that's why I find this is such an important topic, because a divorce, for many people, not all, it's literally like an internal train wreck. It's like an internal catastrophe. And as you said, from the outside, it might really not really look like it. And that's why it's so important for us to learn skills. How do we manage this roller coaster of emotion? And then also on the other side, people who are well, how do we support those who are grieving? Because I know from my personal experience that it would really bother me when I would meet people in the community and they'll act like everything's hunky-dory. And I'm thinking, you have no clue what's going on, darling. Like I am in absolute torment right now. And I found it very strange how certain people would just act like everything's fine. And because what I can say is that, they probably couldn't even perceive what that would be like. But that really taught me that even when I see somebody going through a divorce who I might not know, I might approach her and say, I know you don't know me, but I see you.
Yeah.
I see you, and I know that this is really hard. And just, I want you to know that, like, if you want to just go for a walk or talk or something, I'm here. And they might not follow through because, especially with somebody you don't know well, but to at least acknowledge that, like, I can see that you are in this complete train wreck right now. Okay.
Yeah.
So
that's so crucial, because one of the elements of grief is witness, right? We want someone to witness our pain. We want someone to witness, I'm not going crazy. Like, this is a thing for me. This is a reality for me.
It helps you make sense of it.
Right, exactly.
Right,
and then it
because,
doesn't,
like,
you don't feel like so isolated, right?
That's
You feel
exactly what I was going to say, because then when you're in that stage, which I'm sure that this grief is linked to depression, it's like in a glass box looking from the outside in, and you're very like detached from your surroundings, and somebody just like reaches forward and says, I've got your hand. It's like you're building that, that, okay, I'm here. I'm here. Somebody sees me. Yeah.
Exactly. So witnessing, we don't, you don't necessarily want someone to say empty words, right? It's gonna be okay.
I know, and the whole like, inshallah, mashallah.
Inshallah,
Like, what does
Allah
that
has a
mean?
plan. There's a wisdom
Like,
in this. You're like, oh my God, like, stop talking.
the thing is that, Bisma, those things, of course, are true, and but in that moment, you can't see. Like, I remember when I was in the throes of this misery, and a very devout friend of mine called me. She's like really saintly, and she said, Alhamdulillah khair. She said, everything from Allah is khair. Everything is khair. And I remember thinking, you have no idea what you're talking about, lady. Don't even say stuff like that to me. But now, fast forward, she is 100% right. But yes, there was hikmah and there was khair, but you couldn't see it. But I guess that is to be like, to know what to say at the right time.
There's it's called being tactful, right? Kind of you're not denying that reality. No one is, I'm not saying that that's not true. You're not denying that reality, but kind of knowing when is this person ready to hear it, and when is this person going to find that very alienating? When are they going to find that very judgy, right? Like, kind of realizing
life is a test. Everything in this life is a test. We were not guaranteed happiness in this world. Gee, thanks. I feel so much better right now.
Yeah, and you know what? That might work for some people. Some people will be like, you know what? Yes, this is my test. Other people have other tests. This is mine. But it's hard. That's why we need to check in, right? And I think the best way to do that is really like exactly what you said. When you are in the throes of it, it can feel very isolating. Like I love your description, right? You're in a glass box, you're in a, like, you're kind of in a frosted window, and nobody can and you're kind of feeling very out of it. And actually, that's a really great description of that acute grief, because when people come out of it, they say, I feel like I've been in a haze and I'm waking up. I feel like I've been like, really in a fog, and just almost, like time stands still, and I'm just stuck here. And now I feel like I'm almost coming out of that, like slowly stepping out of, like, if you can even picture like a foggy forest, right? Kind of walking past that haze. So that's a very common feeling of that acute grief, when we're feeling it so intensely. And a part of supporting people is asking them, what do you need from me right now, right? I see you, first of all, and I'm sure this is very difficult for you. And if you don't have to be a divorcee to support somebody, right? You can say,
Right.
like, I may not completely understand, but I'm here for you. What can I do for you? What do you need from me, right?
I've got a question.
Um, mhm.
Uh, if you have any comments on this, there are many people out there who actually really wanted the divorce, especially if it was an abusive situation, a toxic relationship. And despite wanting the divorce, and they still experience so much grief.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you said that. That's actually another aspect of grief that we don't talk about enough, right? It's not, once again, nothing in this arena is cut and dry, right? That's another part of it. So think of it also as, um, when you lose somebody who may be a parent, or a friend who maybe you had a, kind of a ambivalent relationship with, right? Like, you still grieve their loss. And you're right. Like, if you're the one who um pushed for the divorce, or you're the one who started it, or you're the one who wanted it initially, or whatever, some people say, well, I don't really feel like I'm in a position to grieve because I'm the one who wanted this. And it's like, well, I'm on the other side. We can have a complicated relationship. We can have a complicated relationship with that ex-spouse, with that marriage. There is a lot of ambivalence, but the grief will come regardless, because sometimes it's not just about, okay, the end of the marriage, right? It's the end of an identity. I'm no longer XYZ's wife. It's the end of
Into a
dreams you may have
dream,
had.
right?
Yeah,
He said I
exactly.
was going to have a family with my three wonderful kids, and this was going to be, this was going to
Yeah,
be a picture by this age. I was going to do A, B, and C, and you're
exactly.
like, wow, it's just gone up in like a puff of smoke.
Exactly. So it's sometimes it's the end of a dream, right? It's exactly like you said. This was going to be my forever home, and now I have to sell it because I can't be here on my own, you know? This was going to be someone I was going to have grandchildren with, we were going to have more kids, or whatever the case is, have some children, and now that's gone. So it's not just the loss of a person, it's the loss of an identity, an
Or maybe,
idea.
right? Or maybe the person didn't even have children at all.
Yeah.
They think,
Yeah,
now
yeah.
I never have children, or they have a child and they said, I always wanted a sibling for my
I
child.
Right. I
Yeah,
wanted more,
that falls
or
apart, right?
yeah, or like I wanted to see, I wanted to have children with this person, that, what there's, and this is part of that grief too. Like, it comes up in these ways you don't even realize, right? It kind of just comes out of nowhere. You're like, oh, okay. When you buy a car, and you're like, oh, I always thought I would have a person to sign the loan with, like I would have somebody else to co-sign with, or whatever, or like,
Yeah, like a friend of mine who I interviewed also for And She Thrived, she mentioned a moment of which would be, I say, mourning or grief of when post-divorce, and she needed somebody, her husband, or she didn't have someone to unbutton her dress, that she couldn't do it herself. And something so simple like that triggered this mourning and grief.
yeah. So that happens a lot too, right? It kind of comes up in these ways, these little ways you don't realize. Like, I had somebody to do that for me, or I knew somebody who their spouse handled all the car stuff. So car maintenance, getting the car inspected, making sure, the oils were good. And then when they divorced, he moved away, and she was left to do this on her own. And in the beginning, she was very overwhelmed. She's like, I don't even know where to start. What do I do? The battery died. I can't do this. But the funny thing is, when she started doing it, there was that loss, there was that sadness of, I had somebody who would help me. And then there was confidence. oh, I can actually do this on my own. Wow, this is an arena I never really explored before, because I just kind of closed my eyes and was like, yeah, you handle that, right? Which is fine. I mean, there's no point in everybody doing things, like both parties doing the same thing. It's just kind of a waste of energy, right? So that happens in every marriage, family. People naturally take on different roles. But in her case, it was actually a moment of sadness and growth, in that way, that she's like, oh, wow, I have the confidence to call up the insurance place, negotiate a better insurance term that my ex-husband would always do. So there are these moments, pockets of sadness, and also pockets of growth that you can observe, right? But you have to be in that place to observe it. You have to get to that place, right? You can't, that acute grief phase will not really let you be there. So after acute grief is it's called integrated grief. It's like what your friend experienced. Integrated grief is when it's integrated into your life, right? Like, so when we experience something like a divorce or a loss, we're never the same, right? We're not going to be who we were before that experience, because it's been such a momentous loss that it's kind of silly to assume that, okay, you're going to be, who you were before. You can't just unwrite that part of history. You're going to change. You're going to have developed. You're going to have grown, or changed, morphed in whichever way, shape, or form. Now that grief is integrated into you, the way, I don't know, like if you wear like an undershirt or a coat, it's kind of in your space, and it'll show up in these ways. Like, I don't have somebody to unbutton my my dress, or it'll show up in, okay, I can handle everything related to my car insurance now. It'll kind of pop up in these ways. But the way you kind of can tell you're in integrated grief as compared to acute is you're not overwhelmed with emotion when they come, right? So if you're used to your ex-spouse constantly, they handled, let's say, all the stuff related to home repair, and now you're calling plumbers and this and that, and you feel that stab of sadness, you're not a puddle of tears. You're not like so overwhelmed by the emotion that you can't do anything, that you have to sit for 2 hours and cry. You feel it, you expand yourself to let it be there. Maybe you take some deep breaths, maybe you sit, but then you pick up the phone and you call the plumber. Then you acknowledge it, but you're able to continue with your day-to-day life. So that's how you know that you're in the integrated grief period. It comes up in these ways. Maybe, you know um you're, yeah, I don't know, like it just comes up in these in these different ways, shapes, and forms, but it's not like a completely overwhelming experience. So if your spouse typically would help you get high things off the shelf, and now you find oh gosh, I have to go get the ladder, and then you sit with that sadness for a little bit. You're like, wow, this, I never thought I'd be here. I really didn't think that I would be dragging this ladder up the attic to get this. Like, what am I, how did I get here? Right? Like, you sit there, make room for that discomfort, you breathe into it, and you're like, okay, well, I'm here. Let me continue. I can do this. I have this, or whatever. If you're not in that space to feel comfortable or confident, but you still go through with it. If you're in acute grief, you'll like, I can't even think about this. This is too overwhelming. I'm just going to ask someone else to come and do this, or do this another time, right? So that's kind of the difference. The integrated grief means it's just integrated into your day to day. You pass by a street maybe, or an ice cream shop that you guys would get ice cream in, and you feel that stab. Oh, I remember, this is the time when we would go to do this. But you're not like, I have to pull over and sit in sadness because I'm having a panic attack because I can't drive, right? So that's kind of the difference. Sometimes what can happen, and there's actually just disorder now in the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's what psychologists and social workers and them use to get disorders, right? So it's like a diagnostic tool. So that's that's what has like anxiety disorder, panic disorder, all that stuff. More intense ones like schizophrenia, stuff like that. But there's actually one now called prolonged grief disorder, which is it's a little bit contentious, I think, in the community, because people are like, you can't really put a timeline on grief. You can't say, okay, it's been 3 years, you should be over it. But I think what the premise of the diagnosis is that acute grief, right? If it is so overwhelming that it's becoming preventative in your growth or in your continuation, then it becomes what we call complicated grief, right? So that means that it's been some time, your world has gotten smaller because of that grief. So for example, that ice cream shop is so triggering for you that you don't even drive on that street. You're like, oh, I have to go all the way around because I can't pass by it. It's too overwhelming for me. Anything related to cars is so overwhelming that you got rid of your car, or you handed over everything related to your car to your dad or your mom or whatever. So that's complicated grief, when it's so overwhelming that and it lasts for a while, like years and years, and you find that your world is kind of getting smaller. It's not growing, or it's not the way it used to be, right? That is something that you can that's diagnosable, and then there's a particular kind of therapy for it. But the crux, really, honestly, of a lot of these grief counseling therapies is support. It's social support. It's having a witness to your pain. It's having that acceptance that comes with it too. But ultimately, it's creating support networks so that you don't feel like it's just me, I'm the only one who uh, has experienced this, which is very common when we grieve. We feel like it's just me, especially in divorce, because like I said, it's so complicated, right? It's not like the passing of your grandmother, that you're like, I've only known, good things about this person, and so I'm only 100% sad. When you have a divorce, right, there's a reason that it didn't work out. And so there are parts of you where you're like, oh, I feel relief almost, right? Like they actually interviewed, there was a study done for caregivers when the person they were caring for passed, and they found that the number one emotion they had, it wasn't sadness, it was relief, because they're like, they're in a better place, or I'm not having to be on all the time, right? And I think it's very applicable even to a divorce, right? Because there is that tremendous sadness, but there's also a little bit of relief, right? Because you're like, oh,
Yeah,
I can
walking on
breathe.
eggshells.
Exactly. Or like I spilled, I parked weird. Oh gosh, I'm gonna get chewed out. Oh no, I'm not, because I can do whatever I want, I'm not in that space anymore. Or I want to travel. Oh gosh, now they're gonna ask me, but I have to figure out how I'm gonna pay for it or whatever. Oh no, I don't, because that's not the case anymore, right? So it's kind of going back to what we talked about, that kind of ambivalent relationship.
And then also when it comes to being bereaved, there's
Mm-hmm.
feeling of loss, but as you said, it's a sense of like longing or loving that person. But when it comes to divorce, it's like a feeling of loss, but also for not all, but some people, it also affects the self-esteem tremendously.
Oh yeah.
Right. So that's why it makes it more complicated.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's not like, I mean, I find it affects self-esteem for those who were in a caregiving position, because they often will feel very guilty. Like, I could have done more. I should, maybe if we went to the ER earlier, maybe if we, did XYZ earlier. But yes, you're right. In a divorce case, it is a tremendous blow to your self-esteem. It can lead to a very, and part of that I think is because of the identity, right? Because you're like, if I'm not um in a marriage, which I've been in for 15, 7, 6, 2 years, what am I then, right? Like what?
Yes, but not only that, because if the divorce was initiated by the other party,
Yeah,
then it's the belief that there must be something inherently wrong with
right.
you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That person calling it, pulling the plug.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a big element of that too, that how do I then and it's it's funny, it's very easy to then to get into cycles of self-blame, right? Of judgment and blame, like exactly like you said, like there must be something wrong with me. There's a lot of shame and guilt that comes with it too, because they're not willing to stick it out, like you said, right? They're not willing to continue being with me and trying to figure out what the next step is. So a lot of the kind of you standard self-esteem ways we can kind of encourage that can help with this. And the funny thing about self-esteem is um, you kind of get it when you do esteemable acts, right? That's the name of the term. So if you're engaging in stuff in activities that you find helpful or worthy or what have you, it can help boost your self-esteem, right? So whether it's being more present in the relationships in your life, if that's a value to you, like I want to be a better friend, or it's important to me to be a good friend, it's important to me to be a good daughter. Engaging in that can help with your self-esteem. It's important to be a good community member, a good teacher, whatever the roles you're in, can help increase that. But self-esteem is kind of finicky, right? It kind of, if it's dependent on actions, if you're not in the mood to be a good friend, to be a good daughter, then, it can take a blow. So I think coming from a kindness, like a self-compassion type of role, is a little bit easier to manage, because that's there. We can always be kind to ourselves. We can always give ourselves that space. But the other part of grief is, one is that witnessing, and the other part is allowing, right? Allowing yourself that space to grieve, and allowing yourself that space to be kind to yourself, that this didn't work out, but I am not just defined by my marriage, right? I am not just defined by being XYZ's spouse. There are other elements of my identity that I can nurture and grow and continue to bloom. And finding those areas to grow and change in can be very uplifting.
So back to the intensity of the grief, can you mention what are the different strategies you might suggest that a person could utilize when they are just in the depths of grief? And then, as you said, what was the most critical part?
The
Yeah.
acute?
Yes, exactly. So then you have that acute phase where you really, it's like you can't even think straight. So what does one do in that situation? And then also in the when it's that the kind of grief has passed.
So the acute phase, some of it is there's a few things we can do, right? One thing that's really powerful that some grief counselors are using is, because we're so we want that witnessing, we want someone to hear, to see our grief. It can be really powerful and difficult in the beginning, but really powerful to actually write out your story, right? To write out how this marriage ended, how was the death of this marriage, what led to it, kind of how did it come about, how were you feeling before, and then during, and where you are now. Because writing is a very, I'm sure right? You know more than most, right? Writing is a very therapeutic process, and there's something about writing that can help our brain put things, structure things, and kind of get it in a way that makes sense. And it's also a good way to be a little removed from your thoughts. So when you're writing and you're saying, oh well, this divorce happened because whatever I did wasn't good enough, right? That can be very easy for us to adapt, and we don't even question it. We're like, well, whatever I did wasn't good enough. But when you write it, you're like, wait a minute, that can't be right. Like, that's not true. Like this happened years later. So clearly there was something good in the beginning, or, it gives you some distance where you can look at it from a more critical lens, where you're not just incorporating all of the negativity and stuff. So,
right. Like Dr. Caroline Leaf, who is a neuroscientist, she talks about this. It helps the brain make sense of what happened. It's like a process.
Yes. Yeah, that's why for children, right, they do a lot of art therapy, because they're not able to write, so they'll draw. And so they'll draw things like, this is, so for a lot of people I worked a little with children whose parents were divorcing. So I'll often say, okay, can you draw your family for me, right? And so they'll draw, their parents and their siblings. And they'll say, well, isn't that funny? Like, look, your mom and dad, they're not together, but they're still your family unit, right? Because sometimes kids can think, well, what does that look like? What's a why is our family different? Or, what does that mean, right? So something like that, for adults, it's that written process, and for children, it can be the art.
And even with I think I have this book. Is it called Whole Brain Child? And I think it's that one, but it's about that when a child has a traumatic event in his or her life, then you should encourage the child to tell the story. And then what happened? And then you may ask again, and so what happened? And by them retelling the story, the pieces come together and it makes sense in their brain. I'm sure that the same thing for us.
Exactly the same thing. Yeah. So, just the way, and I say this to a lot of people, I'm like, just the way we nurture our children, or the children in communities, we have to turn that nurturing light and that nurturing ability into ourselves. And this is also part of that healing process, right? Is not looking for that timeline of when is this going to be over? When am I going to be on the other side? When will this stop hurting, right? which is makes complete sense. I totally get it. Like I don't think that's irrational, but part of that process is to accept the discomfort, right? The pain and the loss. Sit with it. A good visual, I would say, is um, if you're in a pool and there's beach balls, right? And you imagine those beach balls are all of this pain and this hurt and this discomfort that comes with such a traumatic loss. And you're pushing them away. You're like, no, I don't want to deal with this emotion, this beach ball, this is one is pain. It doesn't work. They keep coming back, you keep pushing, you're using all your energy and getting them off. But if you sit there and you let them bounce away from you, and they'll bop you and they'll pump you and they'll feel it, and just the way you feel those waves of pain. And some of the beach balls are big and they really kind of take you out for a ride, but some of them are small. But that's a lot more manageable. You're not actively fighting it. You're not constantly consumed by it. It's there, it's close to you, you feel it,
Just
but it's not,
embracing it.
you're embracing it, or you're just kind of letting it come by, right? Like there's, so having, that's part of that healing too, that when we think about it, like, okay, I went through something really intense, very, very traumatic, very deeply difficult, a huge transition that's leading to all these different transitions in my life, financial, emotional, familial, right? You're rearranging your family if you have children. You're losing people like in-laws, cousins, maybe your ex-spouse's cousins or family. Like you're losing people that you were, connected to, like on a secondary basis. You're losing maybe, financial security or health insurance or whatever, right? There's different cook, somebody to make you a home cooked meal or a presence at home. So there's some loss that's rippling out. It's not just this cut and dry type of thing. So it's natural to feel those reverberations for a while. But if you fight them, if you're like, no, I have to get over it, this is too painful, it builds up, it gets worse. So part of the acceptance is to sit with that discomfort, and you can breathe through it. You can sit with it, close your eyes, right? Have a mantra, have an affirmation. You can say, um, I'm doing the best I can, right? With what I have. I did the best I could with the skills I had, right? A lot of times that's a good thing to say when you're feeling those waves of guilt, because hindsight is 2020. You can say, oh, I should have done, when they asked me to do XYZ, I should have done that right away instead of fighting them on it. Okay, but we're on the other side of that. So
Do you have any comments on somatic work?
I haven't done too much with somatic work. I think I've worked mostly with more the like the third wave of CBT, which is what I was talking about, like letting the emotions kind of come. So I can't really comment too much on it. I'm not too familiar with it, but I know that it's an important, like a lot of people are drawn to it because it's a very essential part of
Yeah,
healing.
I mean, I personally, in my opinion, I find it absolutely essential to marry that with the cognitive therapy, because the one is more like talk therapy, or and this is like literally how you store that tension and trauma,
Yeah.
like, in your cells.
Yeah.
And a different, I mean, it's not relevant in this specific discussion, but different modalities to that. When it comes to cognitive behavioral therapy, I would agree that that's a very important, maybe at least a stepping stone in terms of overcoming grief, because it's often our thinking that leads to our emotional state.
Yeah.
The person is thinking things like, I'm an absolute failure, I will never get married, I am totally unlovable. Like those are very catastrophic, black and white,
Yes.
extreme thinking, but
Yeah.
they become beliefs, like really
Yes.
like cemented concrete beliefs in a person who has lost a healthy perspective emotionally. And so just sitting with someone who, I don't know if it would really work in the acute phase of grief, but at least
Yeah.
at some stage in the process. Like I remember when I went to go see somebody, and I found her very, very clinical and extremely, she was so like lacking compassion. So
Oh, yeah.
was it a beneficial exercise? Yes, because she made me write down what was the emotion, where do I fit in my body, what
Yeah.
is the thought associated, but it was very like, it was very theoretical and dry.
Yeah, very
And
cold,
and I
right?
find like in her personality, it was just like, and I think that I just in that time needed somebody who's very like nurturing and like supportive. So, but anyway, maybe
No,
not I like
no.
that.
So there's actually a few waves of CBT, right? So this is called the third wave. The third
Okay.
wave is exactly what you're saying. It's saying that CBT has become so clinical, it's become so pulled and removed, and it's all in your head. And the third wave is saying, no, we have to incorporate these emotions into it too, right? So that's a very common CBT practice. It's like, when did you have the feeling? What was the thought behind it? What did the thought lead to? It's like a map, right? You like kind of plan everything out and you kind of see. But I think one good indicator, because this is all well and dandy, but when you're in the throes of these thoughts, it's hard to get out of it. It's easy. I mean, one of the skills that's helpful is identifying when you're having these thoughts, so that before you get into that spiral, you're able to pull yourself out, right? So one way to do that, this is part of that third wave, is instead of saying things like, or thinking things, when you start to think things like, I am the reason this marriage ended, right? Then you just put a little bit of space between yourself and that thought. So you say, I'm having a thought that I'm the reason this marriage ended. And so that's immediately creating some space. And then you can say, well, that's funny. I'm having a thought that, well, I know that just because I'm thinking it doesn't make it true. It may feel that way, but I'm thinking that. So what can I do now to redirect myself so that I'm not falling into, more of these thoughts, right? So it's just about kind of creating that space from yourself and this negative thought, right? This thought that you're having. If you look at it almost like, oof, I don't know if you heard it, it was like thunder.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
If
yes.
if you just look at it from the perspective of kind of like an observer, right? You're just an observer of your thoughts. That's funny. I'm having a thought that I'm the reason my marriage ended. Well, I know that's not the case. But I'm feeling like I'm getting overwhelmed. So what can I do? Can I call somebody I like? Can I do something self-soothing? Breathe through it. Stretch to get out of that headspace, right? So there is an element of in this third wave of knowing that thoughts lead to a lot of these beliefs, right? They're often interconnected, but that we don't want to take the emotion out of it. So there is a place for CBT and for clinical, but you're right. I think it has to come with when you're grieving, you need somebody who's also able to provide you with that compassion, right? With that acceptance and with that more nurturing kind of spirit.
And I'm glad you mentioned the self-soothing, because just as if a baby is crying, you'd rock the child and soothe the child, give the child a pacifier,
Yes.
maybe swaddle the child. And I think
Yeah.
that's very important, that we need to become more aware of what are the different ways that we can soothe ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways, right? Like anything with your senses. So this is part of that, like self-soothing kind of, when you're in that grief, not that integrated grief, and this kind of comes up or something happens, there, anything with senses is a hit, right? It's typically a way to calm yourself down. So I know people who carry something really soft with them because they're like this like a piece of velvet, or a rabbit's foot or something. They're like, it's very soothing for me to touch something soft and comforting. Having tea, right? Or listening to something that you find really comfortable, or some, whatever it is, nature sounds or classical music or whatever, that you find soothing. Something that you can see, like people like nature pictures or family members or something, or some scents that are really comforting to you. Anything with your senses is going to get you out of your headspace. And what you want is to break that brain and that brain connection, so you're not kind of spiraling, right? And so anything involving like your senses will pull your brain out of it. Breathing is really helpful, because breathing literally pulls you out of it. Because when you stop to take these deep breaths, right, your brain is like, oh, okay, I guess things are okay, so we don't have to freak out. So now let's focus in on on the breathing. So
Yes,
that's a really good way.
you're right, it calms the nervous system. And that's why I love these like martial arts or qigong and yoga. There's such intense deep breathing and pranayama,
Yes.
that like anything that is being held will just be released. And interestingly enough, I mean, I've also found that when with Quranic recitation, when one does it aloud, and if you do it with the correct like with the tajweed, and you have to use a lot of your breath and lung capacity, that in itself is quite cathartic.
Yes,
It really
very
is.
much so.
It's the way people would sing from from their core, from their heart. Yeah,
Absolutely. So the folks I work with who are Muslim, I also tell them, I'm like, have some dhikr on hand that you can say when you feel very overwhelmed, right? When you're feeling like I'm getting in my head again, I'm having these thoughts, um, have some dhikr that you have, like, that you can knock out, right? Something that you can say that you don't have to think about. The goal is not to be in a cerebral uh place, to be very thought, to be very like in your head. You want to make it as effortless as possible. So you're like, okay, I'm starting to feel like, and being aware of your body, right? Like, I'm feeling my breathing is getting shallow. I'm starting to have these thoughts. Okay, well, I know that I can do, I can recite Fatiha, I can recite, Ayatul Kursi, and that will kind of calm me down. So those are things you want to just have in store. And the best way really to do this is practice. So you don't want, just the way you don't want to practice a fire drill when there's a fire, you don't want to practice these skills when you're really feeling very overwhelmed. You want to do it in your day to day. It only takes a few minutes, right? Typically. You want to do it when you're at the grocery store and waiting at the checkout line, when you're at a red light, when you're waiting to, grab your kid from the bus stop, or wherever, before bed. It becomes, the more often you do it, then you don't have to think so much about it when you need to
It's
do
like
it.
habit forming to create
Exactly.
healthy habits, right?
Yeah. And I wanted to actually comment on one other thing before I forget that you mentioned. And I think this is because a lot of people say, well, that's good and fine, but how do we know when we're in the throes of this, right? You don't want to be, ideally, you want to be right at the tip and you're able to pull yourself out when these thoughts are overwhelming. So a really good marker is when you're thinking things that are when you're using terms like never, always, absolutely, every time, these very black and white, I was never a good spouse. I'm completely unlovable, right? I will never get married. That's an indicator that, okay, this is not, I'm getting into that place where it can be, unhealthy. Because things we know are never say never, right? There's a lot of nuance to life. There's a lot of it's not so black and white. So whenever we get into this very black and white thinking, that is always a good indicator that let me use some of these skills to pull myself back, right? I'm never going to get over this. I'll never feel better, right? And when you're in the emotion, right, it can also be helpful to think like no emotion lasts forever. When you're in it, you feel like I'm going to cry every day. I'm going to cry and cry. Like I'm never going to get past this. It can feel like that. But kind of reminding yourself like, okay, everybody who starts crying eventually stops, right? But people's pain, I mean, what you don't want is to give yourself like a hard, okay, by March I got to be better, like I can't be doing this anymore, by that time. And I think one of the things I love is in the Quran there are so many stories of bereavement, of sadness, of just overwhelming sadness, of crying, of even in our Prophet some of his life there's so many examples of this. And if you notice, he never, not never, but he embraced it, right? He embraced that sadness. He didn't say, well, my wife passed away X many years ago, so I should just be over it by now. No, he saw a necklace and he cried and he was sad and he held it and he thought about her, right? So that grief was kind of integrated. He let himself feel it, and then he was
Right.
able to
Kind of, it flows like a river. So it doesn't stay, but
exactly.
it flows and then it passes. Yeah.
Exactly. So grief is a river, right? That's a very good way of looking at it. And it will lead you to where you need to go. So I think for those of us who are in the throes of grief, we can ask, what is my grief trying to tell me, right? What is it saying to take a deep breath? Is it saying to pause? Is it saying to feel? Or is it saying, let's continue, right? Let's continue this journey. So looking at it from that, I think that's a beautiful, analogy, looking at it from a river perspective. Some rivers are very intense, right? You can go whitewater rafting in a river. The emotions are very overwhelming, and some are very calm. You can go tubing down a river. It's very relaxed. And that's the way this process can continue also.
So thank you. And then in closing, I think it's important for us to mention how could we help other people support others who are going through grief.
Mm-hmm. I think, the theme that we keep coming upon, right, is that witnessing, is that accepting. So if you reaching out, like it's so crucial for people in grief to have a community, to have a space where they feel comfortable and to have belonging, right? We have groups for people who based on their careers or based on their, children and stuff, but we don't really have groups for people who are going through some emotional difficulty. So this is a great space, what you're doing. You're creating that space for people to come. So I think part of that is to support someone is really, I see you, like you're saying, I hear you. What do you need from me? I know this is hard. What can I do to support you, right? And then also realizing that a lot of times people who are unable to connect, right? It's kind of, it's not you, it's me, right? That type of thing. A lot of us, we grew up not knowing how to deal with other people's intense emotions. We don't know how to deal with it. It's a lot easier to pretend like it doesn't exist. So realizing which of those people in your life, which, who can you reach out to, and who's being helpful, and who is maybe unable to connect with you at this point in your
Right.
life, right?
And I just mentioned like a few tips because
Mm-hmm.
when I was going through that, like there was somebody who I'm not even close to, and she said, I'm just going to I'm going grocery shopping right now. Let me just come pick you up.
Uh-huh.
And it was just so random, but she came out of her way and picked me up, and I just tagged along while she did her grocery shopping at Costco or whatever. And something so random, like I always remember that
Yeah.
because that was being supportive.
Yeah.
When I felt like things were falling apart, somebody was there to at
Mhm.
least give me space and like a kind word,
Mhm.
um, or you could just show up at a person's house and say, hey, can I help? Just go there and like wash the dishes or do something
Yeah.
that you feel that, because when a person is in grief, they feel overwhelmed, right? So just
Yes.
helping here and there, or maybe watching the child, let me take the
Mhm.
child out here, or if the person's feeling upset, come, let's go for a walk. So
Yes.
sometimes I feel like it's unhealthy just like talk and bemoan, but let's get
Absolutely.
come. Let me pick you up. Let's go for a walk in the park. And
Yeah.
and if the person wants, and let them, I think it's so important to like allow people to feel safe to cry.
Yes.
You always have this thing
100%.
like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. And like you want to like suck it in and like suppress it. But no, just cry. Like if you
Yeah.
need to cry, cry.
Yeah. No,
And,
I'm so
and I
glad you
think,
said
yes,
that.
and I think
Yeah.
it's crazy that people have to like pay a therapist in order to cry. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, why we don't have to have such a formalized session for crying. We should be able to cry with anyone that,
Yeah.
is a friend, really.
Yeah. The thing is that, like I said, a lot of us, we just didn't grow up with that skill set, right? Because holding someone else's pain can also be very overwhelming. So you want to make sure that the people that you're with are in a space where they can handle it too, right? So you want to make sure that, that it doesn't become overwhelming for them, and then it's just like everyone's overwhelmed. Everyone's overwhelmed. But yes, I completely agree. I think we do apologize a lot for our emotions, right? We do apologize a lot for the overwhelming ones, because for many of us, we just didn't grow up in families that encouraged it, that allowed it, whether and most of our families didn't realize they were doing that, right? So even for me, sometimes when my kids are sad, or like I feel like, oh, this is uncomfortable, like don't feel sad, just feel better, here, let me get you something, right, to get it over, let's go out for, let's get an ice cream or whatever. And I'm like, no, let them be sad, it's okay, it's that river, right? If you always stop it, you just put a dam up on it, what happens? Builds over, and then at that point it's so overwhelming, you don't really even know where to begin, where to start. But it can be very overwhelming for the other person, right? So you want to make sure that that the people that you're with are able to kind of handle that as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bisma. It was an
Of
interesting
course.
discussion.
No, thank you. I'm so glad we were able to connect. And yeah, I'm so
Yes, and
glad
I'll link your information if anyone would like to contact you.
okay, great. Wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a
All
wonderful
right.
day.
You
Salam.
too, take care. Bye, Bisma.